Dr. Mai Musie, thank you for joining me today for this HistFest video. Obviously, you and I both know that this is our second attempt because I, being the fool that I am, deleted the first recording. So it's very kind of you to have agreed to do this again.
Absolute pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you. So first things first, I wanted to ask you about what drew you to the research that you do. You specialise in ancient novels and texts. So could you tell me about that, please?
Yeah, of course. I think it was during the sort of third year of my undergraduate degree and for the most part of my master's, I became interested in Greek history and literature. And I had an incredibly enthusiastic and inspiring professor who led on those modules. I found that the focus on ethnicity and the fluidity of identities in the novels very appealing. And my first sort of immersion really was a text from the 3rd to 4th century AD called the Ethiopian Story, or in Greek called the Atopika. From an author whose name means descendant of the sun, Heliodorus. Personally too, I was intrigued by what sort of Ethiopian they were talking about. This was pretty much a broad term in the ancient world. It meant burnt faces, and so, so it can mean anything from North Africa to South Africa. But as the kind of centuries went by and exploration of travel and more knowledge about the geography of Africa happened, it became a bit more focused to the northeast, particularly in Ethiopia, and through the knowledge of the Aksumite civilization of Ethiopia, there was far more understanding of what that word meant. I was also intrigued from it, from a kind of being from an Ethiopian and Eritrean heritage, of what that said really about sort of Northeast African kind of cultures and how they were viewed from Greeks and Romans and Egyptians. So by the point, so I was already, sort of interested in how different ethnic groups were represented in the ancient world before that, before my kind of novel immersion. So I was looking at, say, how the Egyptians were portrayed, how the Scythians were portrayed, and the Persians and the Assyrians and so forth. And then for my MA thesis, I wrote a representation of Ethiopians in Greek literature, Ethiopians with quotation mark, from Homer's Trojan War epic, the Iliad, to Herodotus's histories and beyond. So I guess it wasn't really a surprise when I undertook the PhD studies that I wanted to kind of concentrate on the Greek novels and how different ethnicities were represented within, that kind of period of the text. And, just thinking about the sort of, at the heart of the Greek novels, ethnicity and fluidity was very much an explored theme. And looking at the sort of main writers such as Heliodorus, who tells us he's Syrian, Reardon from Aphrodisias, so modern Turkey, Eclistatius from Alexandria in Egypt, and Xenophon from Ephesus. Longest being the odd one out, so there's sort of 5 complete Greek novels, but I'll go into that later on. So I guess the sort of general common theme about these 5 Greek novels concentrated on a young, beautiful, highly educated Greek couple after falling in love face many trials and tribulations before finally being reunited at the end of each story. Now, these trials and tribulations usually consist of separation from each other and encounter with the other. Their sort of adventure is sometimes instigated by kidnapping, shipwrecks, or oracles, kind of thrust these heroes in from the center, which is the sort of Greek world, to the sort of periphery, which is the sort of kind of like the unknown world. And these are usually inhabited by sort of very stereotyped ethnic groups. So crafty Egyptians, the degenerate Persians, pious Ethiopians, and mystical Indians. So these kind of diverse ethnic groups and individuals are actually described through the eyes of the Greek protagonists and the narrator, against a really kind of huge backdrop of long and complex Greek and Roman literary and historical tradition of the representation of the other.
Wow. I mean, I was going to ask you about the evolution of the novel, because focusing on the 17th century, I've always been led to believe that the novel emerged during the early modern period, but
yes,
evidently, from everything you're saying, it was very much around and alive during the ancient period as well. Could you tell me a little bit about this period, or the period you're focusing on, and the period that these novels were written, and who was reading them, and what was the world like at this point in time?
Oh gosh.
Questions.
Big questions. I suppose just taking it from the sources themselves, and this is, a lot of it is down to interpretations. I just want to kind of be clear about dealing with ancient texts, and we have to use multiple kind of angles to try and get the sort of information that we require. So the kind of period of where when these novels were written was pretty much from, say, the 1st century AD to the 4th century AD. And that period was pretty much a kind of a high period of the Roman Empire. So before that, you had, sort of the Greeks, the golden period of the Persian Wars, and thereafter the 5th century BC, and then you went through the 4th and 3rd century political up and down, and you had a Greek empire which was led by Alexander the Great, and so you had this kind of flourishing post-Alexander of the Hellenistic Empire, the Greek Empire, and so there was this great exploration of beyond going sort of through from your own little city-state to a kind of united, sort of Greek entity, and trying to colonize other areas and make them into Greek colonies. So there was this kind of expansion of Hellenistic culture, but there was also this sort of cultural kind of mixing pot of, sort of East and West meeting and having these kind of cultural exchanges happening. And that, kind of happened on a multiple level, on a kind of political and socioeconomic systems, but it also happened on a very sort of literary kind of aspect. So you had exploration of East, like Egyptian and Assyrian and Persian, and sort of various other cultures having an impact on the kind of literature that was written down. But then at that time period, Greeks were also exploring their own identity of what it was like to be under the Roman Empire. So by this point, the Greek Empire was kind of taken over by the Romans, and so the Romans had the kind of political upper hand, although the Romans were in awe of Greek culture. So there was this kind of weird dominance of a kind of passive, politically Greek culture, but then being quite strong in terms of the cultural output within a Roman Empire, which was led by a very powerful kind of sort of Roman system.
Yeah.
So there are very many things like identities being explored, and very much the novels concentrate a lot of what it is to be Greek under the Roman Empire, what it is to be Roman and Greek, and Syrian and Greek and Roman. And at that time too, people like certain groups of people, so mainly women, began to have greater control in terms of socioeconomic kind of factors, and also about their own education too. So you had very much women who went from a kind of motherly, wifey role from sort of the 5th century BC right to the kind of Roman Empire, where their role began to change, and they began to get far more sort of independence.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, that is sort of reflected, those two images are actually reflected in the Greek novels too.
Okay, so the questions, as you say, questions of identity, and then also, you know, in all its guises, and whether that's race, ethnicity, or womanhood as well, are all present in these novels. Well, could you, just for anybody that might not be familiar with one of these stories, would you mind outlining perhaps your favourite ancient novel?
Yes, of course.
A succinct overview.
I suppose that because I've had far more concentration on this particular novel, which seems to have been in my life since my undergraduate days, I'll explore Heliodorus's novel. It consists of sort of 10 books. It's quite a meaty novel, so you have to have some sort of patience in comparison to the other novels, which are perhaps you know, exist in sort of smaller kind of book chapters. So Heliodorus's novel kind of stands out really for a number of reasons. It's far more complex. It deals with complex issues, but the sort of narrative structure is actually far more kind of complex than other novels before it. And you know, the sort of time period it's sort of written is towards the later end of the kind of Roman Empire. So things would have looked quite different to, say, the early part of this Greek novel kind of flourishing. So I think in some respect, he deals with some topics differently than, say, his earlier counterparts, and they are far more sort of nuanced and complicated attitudes. So the novel tends to start in the middle, and you know, this is a sort of a very cinematic sort of scene of where we are viewing what is taking place on a, you know, sort of beach, a shipwreck in the shores of Egypt, through the eyes of some Egyptian bandits, and we're trying to piece together of what's happened. And later on, the sort of narrative is told through different narrators, and sometimes these narrators may not, in some respect, tell the truth. So you, so you're a bit like a detective trying to put together a very complex story through kind of nuggets of information, or a bit like Hansel Gretel, kind of getting the crumbs towards the end. Now, what is really interesting about this novel is that it tends to sort of move away from this idea of the protagonist returning to the known Greek world and actually sort of settling in the sort of periphery of the known world. And so this kind of, you get a chance to see what Heliodorus is doing that is quite different, because it tends to be a sort of, you know, kind of linear, you know, from the Greek world, go to Egypt, and then end up in Ethiopia, whilst the other novelists will start in Greece and then in Greece, which is very much like, say, Odysseus' journey in the Odyssey. And so we've kind of shifted the sort of monster kind of model of where Odysseus meets, you know, the Cyclops, the Circes of this world, etc. And they are replaced by Persians and Egyptians and Indians and Ethiopians. And so it kind of leads us through what Greeks would have thought about these ethnic groups from a sort of a historical literary past, but also the kind of complex political situation that was going on with Romans' kind of interaction with the sort of Parthians, who kind of took over the Persians as a strong kind of political enemy. And so you're getting this kind of, the novelists tend to set his story, you know, sort of many centuries before the Roman Empire. So you're getting this sense of looking back at this kind of glorious Greek past with, you know, a kind of contemporary political and social sort of setting. And that becomes quite interesting because it impacts on how different ethnic groups are viewed in a sense from the past and the present, which is a kind of mishmash.
Yeah.
Now, what is quite profound about this novel is that it's not just about them ending up in Ethiopia, but this is a big spoiler, I'm afraid.
No.
No, it makes it worthwhile. It really does. The Greek heroine turns out to be Ethiopian. So
Okay.
so there is actual exploration of skin color in the novel, which you wouldn't normally see at that time period, but also in the kind of past literary texts. So the reason why she was born white is because her, sort of Ethiopian, royal parents happened to be looking at a picture when they were copulating, and this picture was of Andromeda and Perseus. And so Andromeda in Greek mythology was an Ethiopian princess, and Perseus was a Greek hero who came to rescue her from a sea monster. And that is often depicted, and I'm just thinking about, it was St. George's Day, was it yesterday?
Yeah.
And actually the imagery of, sort of this white heroine being saved from a kind of sea serpent, kind of dragon-esque, from Perseus, who comes in flying on his horse, is very much kind of taken up in sort of medieval modern imagery of St. George and the kind of princess. So there's multi-layers within it.
Yeah.
And so, the Greek heroine, who doesn't know that she's black, really, is sort of goes through this journey through sort of various guides in the novel who lead her to her true identity. So there's that.
So it's a plot device as as much as all the other facets that you've said as well, which is really interesting to think about.
Yes.
how these things are used and were used by early writers.
Yes, absolutely.
I wondered about the legacy of I mean, you've touched on it a little bit already, but the legacy of these novels, how did they, what life did they have after the period, and do they continue to have?
Yes. So, I mean, it was quite difficult for quite some time in our own kind of discipline, scholarship, of what was the sort of reception of these novels, and actually there's been so much work now. It's quite interesting. Well, we didn't think that they were very popular in the sort of early to modern period. Actually, we find that they were very popular. It's just that some of the novels were more popular than others, depending on each period. So during the kind of medieval period, sort of 12th century, Byzantine authors found the sort of theme of chastity and virginity and martyrdom very, very interesting. And that's the kind of centered around the Greek protagonists, their kind of chaste lives, and sort of the kind of being, kind of respectful to their bodies, and, this just having this kind of religious sort of ideals to hold themselves against. And that found flavour in terms of, sort of the 12th century and particularly medieval period, of where it influenced a lot of Christian literature. And then, sort of the exploration of travel and the exploration of knowledge in the sort of greater novels on the fringes happened to be sort of found reception during the Renaissance period and early modern period. Particularly, I'm just thinking about Don Quixote and Tom Jones and so forth, about this kind of adventurer type who goes exploring on his own to, sort of either acquire knowledge or just have, sort of
like a hero's journey.
Yeah, exactly. And another one which is quite a lot of sort of modern, should I say, early to modern authors have been drawn to, is that one of the Roman novels called Apuleius' Metamorphoses is pretty much a it's got one big novel, and then within it there is a mini novella, and Apuleius's narrator is a person who is seeking sort of answers, kind of knowledge and answers, but also kind of to magical kind of rites. And at some point he is desperate to know about transformation from this witch's home, and he tells a servant in this witch's house to spy and let him know how to do a kind of the experiment of her turning into a bird or that sort of thing. And there is a a mistake made with the recipe, and he turns himself into an ass. And so the whole story consists of him as an ass experiencing, the sort of trials and tribulations. And then within this novel, there is a story of Cupid and Psyche, which tells of Psyche, who's the youngest of 3 daughters, who gets married off to Cupid, who is never seen. He's considered a monster. He's far away in this castle, etc. You can't see the servants. The Jude mysteriously appears, etc. And her older sisters, who are very plain and very jealous of the riches, etc., that she gets, are sort of give her various tasks to find the true identity of her monster husband. Obviously, this is to her detriment in the end. But this kind of gets relayed, and in the sort of fairy tales, in Grimm fairy tales of various interpretation of Cinderella and Beauty and the Beast and that kind of thing. So then also with the kind of female-centered kind of roles within the novels, you can find that within, Pamela and Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles and so forth. So I think that's up to sort of early modern, and then within the modern period, you can find certain themes from Petronius's novel, the Satyricon, which is the excess, the kind of luxury and excess of the Nero period, kind of in the Great Gatsby novel, and also in the Bonfire of the Vanities in the 80s, which talks a lot about the sort of stock market and the excess of the 80s too. So it's not, it's not a sort of cut-off period of where actually none of the novels ever had, the light of day. They still continue to, the themes still continue to resonate.
Goodness, well, thank you for that. That's a really thorough overview. And if anybody wanted to learn a little bit more about these novels, is there a book that you could suggest that they might buy?
Yes. So I suppose the book I would recommend is just a collection of these Greek novels, and they include some fragmentary tales of the novels within the on the fringes, and that book is by B. Reardon, and it's called the sort of collected ancient Greek novels, which is quite hefty, but it has. Yeah, I mean, it not only includes the 5 complete novels, but it goes beyond there, including Lucian's True Story, which is considered one of the earliest science fiction novel, talking about sort of planetary exploration and intergalactic warfare.
Wow. Okay. Well, we'll put a link to that book on the bottom of this video. And just one final question.
Sure.
What are you up to at the moment? What's your next research project? I know obviously we're in lockdown right now, but
yeah. So we are, a colleague of mine working on a joint article to go into a handbook of classics and post-colonial theory, which is going to be sort of submitted by the end of the year. And I'm also, kind of, when I should have the time, really, shouldn't I, to try and turn my thesis into a book. So working on a monograph. But you know, I'm always intrigued by sort of exploration of ancient and modern, you know, sort of ideas. So it's not just about books, but looking at articles and yeah, sort of
Okay, well, we look forward to that.
yeah, you know, telling the world about how amazing classics is.
And it is, and you've done that today.
Thank
May,
you.
it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for doing this a second time with me.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Rebecca.
Well, we'll speak soon, but thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.